Assange. My next guest, I'm very excited to announce, is Craig Murray. He is a human rights activist, a whistleblower, a former British ambassador. Mr. Murray, welcome. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
So you are a longtime friend of WikiLeaks. Why are you such a staunch supporter of the organization?
Well, I guess I saw when I worked within government the kind of dreadful things governments can do in the name of national security, the lack of honesty, the lack of transparency, the lying to the public about what they're doing. And I realized that it's absolutely essential that citizens have access to information about what's being done in their name. And really, I had that experience just at the same time that WikiLeaks came to prominence. And WikiLeaks has been an essential tool in that. Our view of the world is so much more informed than it would be were it not for WikiLeaks.
How do you imagine the world would look? I've never asked this of any guests yet, but how do you imagine things would be different if not for WikiLeaks at this point in time?
I think at the moment we have a huge revolt against the mainstream and corporate state media among ordinary people. It's something we're seeing in the UK with this case of the poisonings in Salisbury and the Skripals. If you go to social media, you find that the overwhelming majority of people just don't buy the extraordinary line being put out by the government. And I think that idea that governments lie, governments don't tell you the entire truth, it is extremely important, and is something that WikiLeaks was central to putting out. And especially, of course, if you go back to the collateral murder videos and the Chelsea Manning revelations, which were the big breakthrough from WikiLeaks, and then so much they've put out since, including, of course, the DNC and the Podesta emails, the knowledge that the playground was rigged against Bernie Sanders. People only know that for certain because of WikiLeaks. It's transformed the view of millions and millions, of billions possibly, of people around the world. It's enabled them to work and socialize free from the constraints of the propaganda which had been controlling them.
Yeah, that's huge. Yeah, and I think you're absolutely correct about that. The rulers basically have lost control of the narrative to some extent, and you saw that so clearly in the Skripal case, did you not? Just how there was all this attempt to regain control of the narrative, and at a certain point, they reminded me of someone on roller skates who had lost balance and was just flailing all over the place to try and regain their balance, And yeah, I think that's largely because of WikiLeaks. I strongly agree.
Yeah, no, that's very true indeed. I mean, Julian Assange in particular is going to be seen by historians as a central figure in the moment when the way we get our information changed, in the switch to essentially communally shared information between people rather than information that's fed us by states and by corporations. Julian's been a catalyst. He's not, of course, he's not the change itself, but he's definitely been a catalyst in making that transformation much more effective than it might otherwise have been. And I believe he'll come to be seen in future as an extremely important historic figure, much more important than any of the small politicians who currently strut about on the world stage.
You know Julian personally, like as a person. What do you like about him as a man?
He's retained tremendous sense of humor, given the dreadful circumstances that he's in. He's good fun to be with. He's very different from the persona that's been portrayed about him in public. He's not at all brash or forceful. He's quite diffident in many ways. Well, once he gets talking on a subject, he gets very, very interested. And what I like about him, which I always like in people, is one of these people who often pursues his own line of thought while talking. You know, he's intellectually interested in you. He's intellectually interested in the subject of the conversation. And you can tell that while he's talking, suddenly other trains of thought will occur to him, and he'll go off on different and interesting pathways. And he's very open. He's very, very open to disagreement, to other points of view, and to new information. So no, he's really a very fascinating person to spend time with.
How do you imagine that personality is coping with his current situation?
Well, I think it must be extremely difficult for him. It's never been easy in the Ecuadorian embassy. It's physically an extremely limited space. People don't realize, perhaps, that the embassy is just a small apartment. It's not even a particularly big apartment. It's an apartment. That's all it is. It doesn't have a garden. It doesn't have anything. It's just an apartment. And he's been confined, because of course the embassy is still operating. He's confined to a very small part of that apartment most of the time. I was most annoyed when the dreadful right-wing judge Arbuthnot gave a judgment against him earlier this year in the appeal by his lawyers against the continued warrant for his arrest for jumping bail. The judge said that his conditions weren't onerous, and if he wanted exercise, he could go onto the balcony. Well, the balcony is perhaps it's less than 1 meter wide and at most 1.5 meters long. It's hardly a place you can exercise. And on top of that, he doesn't have access to it. It's off the ambassador's office. He's been allowed onto it about twice a year, and currently not at all. So that kind of taunt, really, by the judge, made light of the conditions in which he is kept. But the psychological impact of adding to that, the fact that he's incommunicado, I can't see him anymore. None of his friends can get in to see him. He has access to his lawyers in much the same way that somebody in prison gets occasional access to their lawyer. And obviously, what used to be very friendly relations with the Ecuadorian embassy have become less friendly. So, the atmosphere for him and around him must have become extremely chill. And it's worth saying that the member of staff of the Ecuadorian embassy, one excellent Ecuadorian diplomat, a very good man. I'm not going to name him in case it does harm to his future career. But somebody who's been very, very helpful, very supportive, very conscientiously doing his job for his country as a diplomat. And I know that because I used to be one. I know how people should operate. But who had the role largely of liaison between WikiLeaks and the Ecuadorian government. He has been, I think, actually dismissed the service, not just removed from that post, in order to remove that friendly conduit. So it's fairly plain to me that the Ecuadorian government is actually trying to initiate what Theresa May would call a hostile environment for Julian within the embassy. It must be absolutely bloody awful at the moment.
It's like it reminds me of a medieval siege in a way. It's like they're trying to starve him out.
It's something
just
along
by
those lines.
Cutting him off.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fairly plain that the Ecuadorian government is now hoping that the embarrassment will end by them making life so impossible for Julian that he voluntarily walks out to get arrested. That seems to be where they see the end game going. I refrained until a month ago. I didn't make any public comment at all that was critical of the Ecuadorian government, partly because I was, extremely happy with the behavior of the Ecuadorian government from the start, and the fact that they very bravely stood up to the United States, they stood up to the United Kingdom, they stood up to Spain and the European Union, all of whom were putting massive pressure on them, including economic pressure, including obviously financing opposition parties through the CIA in order to try to overthrow the government, which they would have done anyway of the leftist government. But I'm sure that Julian being there gave them an incentive to put added effort into that. And despite all those pressures, the Ecuadorian government had stood firm and behaved in a very principled way. And I thought we should give them, the benefit of that and give them time before we moved to criticizing them. But I'm afraid to say that, the extremely disappointing attitude of Lenin and his move towards the United States and towards reconciliation with the right-wing forces within his own country. And again, I'm a realist. I understand why he's trying to do that for political and personal survival, but he's not the man his predecessor was. That is for sure.
Yeah, and Ecuador certainly deserves credit for having done what it did, and that was great and very praiseworthy. It has been very disappointing last few months, indeed. I've been told that we're getting a lot of questions about what people can do to help WikiLeaks, and I've got a few links that I'll share, but as someone who's been an active pro WikiLeaks activist, is there anything you would like to share with our viewers about things that they can do to help the cause of WikiLeaks?
Well, I should
and
start
Assange.
I should start by saying something which is not always understood, which is I'm not actually part of WikiLeaks myself. I'm not formally any kind of part of the organization.
Right.
I'm just a friend of WikiLeaks, let me put it, a friend and supporter. I guess in a sense I'm a supporter the way those people wanting to support our supporters. And there's a great deal that you can do. I don't have knowledge at the moment of the current avenues for financial donations, because money is always needed, unfortunately. But and also, of course, the system and the governments have done everything they can to cut off avenues for donations. But I'm sure that information is available and people can find. Start local WikiLeaks groups.
Yeah, I have that.
Local WikiLeaks support groups. Find the WikiLeaks support groups online through Twitter. Get in touch with them and make your own local group. Get together people in your town. I was talking earlier about the importance of new media, in effect, and the internet and new sources of information in effectively nullifying an awful lot of the roots of propaganda that have been controlling populations for a great deal of time. But the other half of that has to be going back to the oldest method, which is personal social communication. Because one of the problems in society is we've become desocialized. People don't any longer belong to the community groups, and they could be any kind of community groups. They could be churches, they could be Rotary clubs, they could be brass bands, they could be Boy Scouts. All these kind of institutions have falling memberships, because increasingly what people want to do in their spare time is sit at home, order a pizza and watch TV. Society is becoming desocialized to a large extent. I was chatting to, about a few years ago now, but I was chatting to the professor at Berkeley, I think, or Stanford, who did the famous experiment 20 years ago with the students who were instructed to apply pain to people and went ahead to do it. I think his name's Margrain, but my memory for names is very poor. And he'd done some very interesting new research in which he said that basically the images, although the reporting from the Iraq War was very controlled, the images which were available and which did get published, including in the main media, were horrific. And actually, although there were some horrific images out of Vietnam, including, of course, the famous one of the little girl running away burned by napalm, both the quality of horror in the images and the quantity of them available to the general public, there was actually a greater quality and quantity from Iraq of that kind of horrible image, but it didn't get the public reaction. People didn't react with empathy to these horrible images in the way they did to horrible images from Vietnam. And that appeared to be because of the decline of empathy in the general population. And he put it down to the kind of desocialization I was discussing. That was where his research was leading. It was because people didn't interact socially with other people as much as they used to, and were more kind of individual consumers of entertainment in very small family units. Empathy was declining. Our ability to feel sorry for people was declining. So that was a long digression from saying start a local group, get to meet people, find someone you don't know in your local community who is interested in WikiLeaks, and get together and discuss it with them. Lobby your politicians. I think it's very important that we make it politically very difficult for Julian to be moved to the United States to face charges of espionage. We need to make plain that would be an attack on free speech that would not be tolerated. It's interesting how politicians, of course, their number one interest is in keeping their job and making money for themselves. And they are very sensitive to public opinion. They get 6 letters on the subject, and they're suddenly worried hundreds of people might not vote for them and they might lose their job. So writing personal letters to your member of parliament or representative, whichever country you're in, that sometimes has more effect than you imagine it might do.
That's really great. Thank you. I have some information here for financial donations as well. I am wikileaks.org/donate. You can donate in support to the most under threat journalist organization in the world. JusticeForAssange.com to learn about his case, and CourageFound.org to support whistleblowers and truth tellers worldwide. So you guys can check that out. Yeah, money is a really great way to help WikiLeaks and Assange, especially Assange, because all those lawyers that are going in there, a lot of them cost money. Some of them are great, some of them are pro bono at different times, but that's costs a good chunk of change, as well as just operating procedures and whatnot.
That's very true. I mean, it is important to say, as you say, that he does have a lot of wonderful lawyers who do work for him for nothing, but they can't, of course, get necessarily people to do all the rest of the work that needs doing, all the grunt work, if you like, that's need doing by other lawyers. Sometimes you do need to pay.
Right. Yeah. It's a massive project. You can't disrupt the machine for free, unfortunately. So what would you like to see happening? Obviously, you want to see Assange, get his voice back. What, in an ideal world, what would happen in the next few years with WikiLeaks and Assange?
Well, I think I do think that there would be quite a strong public reaction to any attempt to send Julian to the United States to face espionage or other charges for publishing. One interesting point is that the CIA are not stupid. You should never think your opponents are stupid. And one of the reasons they choose sexual allegations when they wish to demean and diminish a person, reduce their reputation in the public eye, is that it works. And at the time when what Julian faced were these allegations, which frankly were extremely thin, it was a very clever move by them, because it immediately cut Julian off from much of the left, because of the unfortunate fact that conviction rates for rape are extremely low, but it's a crime which is very difficult to prove. It's a dreadful crime which people, and it's one of the crimes that's easiest to get away with. There are large sections of the left who believe that as soon as the accusation is made, you have to believe it, whatever the circumstances and whatever the evidence. And so the ability to cut off Julian from his natural support by making false allegations of that particular type was quite effective. We shouldn't kid ourselves. It actually worked and made it very hard for many people on the left to feel free to come out and support Julian. But now that issue is gone, once the question is of free speech, and the question is, should this man be imprisoned possibly for the rest of his life for publishing documents which were leaked to him which reveal wrongdoing by government? That's a very different question. And my view is that gradually, and it may take some time, that the focus will shift there, and that will bring about the kind of radical shift in public opinion, because essentially, as long as the Tories are in power in the UK, then they're very unlikely to back down on Julian, because they've set out their stall, and they've been very insulting about him, and they've they've made sure that the entire establishment, including the judicial establishment, is taking a ridiculously hard line, including on bail. There are thousands and thousands of people in the UK who have jumped bail. There's only one person who's under surveillance having jumped bail. And there's no precedent anyone can think of, really, for anybody being actually tried for jumping bail for an offence on which allegations have been dropped and there are no charges. So this is kind of unprecedented action which they're seeking to take. My view is the climate will change on all of that. But I also think that, that's got to be part of the wider social transformation as well. I think you're talking what will happen in the next few years. I think we will, pray God, get rid of the Tories in the UK, which will make an environment in which it's going to be much easier to find a solution to the WikiLeaks crisis. Nothing that could even happen this year. I think the Tories are showing every sign of falling apart. So I think the answer is essentially political. And then I hope that WikiLeaks will go from strength to strength and be able to operate fairly openly. I'm looking forward to the day where WikiLeaks has nice plush offices where they can invite me for lunch. The last thing. Of course, I don't want them to become corporate. And one of the dangers is, of course, that things which initially are helpful do become corporate. One of the problems we have at the moment is the gatekeeper role of Facebook and Twitter, and all social media is dependent on corporations, Google.
Right.
I don't think there's a danger that WikiLeaks ever would transform into that kind of corporate gatekeeper. But I don't want to see WikiLeaks become corporate. I want it to remain guerrilla. I want it to remain linked to pirates and anonymous and those kind of people. And I want it still, of course, to be an avenue for leaks. And I'm sure it will be that. But I would like it to be able to operate openly, from a registered address, and have staff who walk in and out without fear of arrest or intimidation or being stopped at airports. And I do believe we'll get there. I think WikiLeaks will eventually become, one of the most respected organizations in the world and acknowledged with that status. Perhaps even with diplomatic status. That would be interesting.
That's a really beautiful vision. That's definitely, you've given us a really concrete target to shoot for, and a clear marker for when we'll know we're out of the woods with this corporate slave state. As if WikiLeaks is able to function like a normal organization and not have to not be prosecuted and persecuted at every turn. We got a question from someone. If you could please give a brief background on your own persecution by the state in the past, and do you see parallels between how you were treated and how Julian is being treated?
Okay, well, I'll try to do that fairly briefly. I was in the British diplomatic service for over 20 years. I had quite a successful career. I was an ambassador at 42, which in British diplomatic service terms is extremely young. And I'd been in the senior civil service for 6 years at that stage. And I came across plain evidence whilst in Uzbekistan that we were knowingly and deliberately receiving intelligence from the torture chambers. And it was intelligence which was just untrue. It exaggerated the role and the threats posed by Al-Qaeda in Central Asia. And it was accepted because the government wanted an exaggerated Al-Qaeda threat in Central Asia, because that justified their arms sales, that justified their moves with the dictatorships there in order to secure oil supplies or oil resources, that kind of thing. It was a use of torture to get false intelligence and the use of the intelligence to justify hidden agendas of government to make money, in effect. And I should say, I didn't start off as being, fantastically radical. I'd been in this service for 20 odd years, and I hadn't really come across it. I'd come across a couple of things I thought were a bit dubious, but I'd not come across anything that really made me think, wow, I just can't do this. But at that stage, obviously, I just thought, well, I'm just not going ahead with this. But I was very conditioned into the system, and I behaved like a proper civil servant. And I set out my very neat arguments on why we shouldn't get intelligence from torture, including the ethical and moral ones, and the practical one that the intelligence wasn't true. And I set that out in a top secret telegram, which I didn't tell anybody about, and sent to Jack Straw, the Foreign Secretary. And I didn't get an answer. Then 2 months later, I did it again. And I should say, the Americans call them cables. We call them telegrams in our diplomatic service. And I got summoned back from London. I was told at a meeting that the policy was that we should get intelligence from torture, and that our Foreign Secretary, Jack Straw, and the head of MI6, Richard Dearlove, had a meeting. They discussed the objections I'd raised, and I was to know that no, the policy was we would indeed get intelligence from torture. And I was just a civil servant, and it was my job to do what I was told, not to question it. That was a brief summary of the meeting. So anyway, we continued arguing about it for about a year, and eventually I got sacked. But before I was sacked, when I got back after that meeting, about a month later, they suddenly threw at me, completely out of the blue, about 18 allegations of misconduct. And here's a good parallel with Julian. One of the allegations they threw at me was sexual. They claimed that I had been issuing visas in exchange for sex, which in effect, I mean, in my view, that's the same as an accusation of rape. It's saying that you're blackmailing people into sex in order to get their visas.
Right.
And I should say, it's a terrible accusation. I should say completely and utterly untrue. Absolutely no truth in it whatsoever. They also claimed I was a habitual alcoholic. They claimed that I had driven a Land Rover down a flight of stairs. That was one of the charges. Various other claims as well, and they were, and I was of course suspended for 4 months, and there was a full investigation, and during that period, it was put to me that I could resign as ambassador to Uzbekistan and stop making these problems about torture, and if I did that, they would give me another posting, possibly as ambassador to Denmark, and there'd be no blot on my record. But that if I didn't resign, then these charges would have to go ahead, and the newspapers would all find out, etc. I told them where to go, and so, true to their word, they leaked all the charges to the Daily Mail, and which is a particularly outrageous British tabloid. I found myself on the front page of the Daily Mail for my sex life. One or two of the allegations about my sex life were in fact true, but they didn't involve coercion or blackmail or force, or they were activities between consenting adults, but not necessarily what you would want, all over the front pages of a newspaper. But the government does that to people. If you become somebody that they decide they want to get rid of, and I should say they did that to me before I went public with any of the documents or any of the objections I'd been making to torture. It's a good sign of how ruthless the state can be. And eventually, I was sacked and lost my career. Although, interestingly enough, and this, I'm sorry, I'm in the middle of a field where we're building a music festival, which is why
we're still hearing you okay. You're coming through you're coming through just fine.
Okay, that's good. Interestingly enough, this is where governments are strange. After the 4-month suspension and the investigation of these 18 charges against me, I was actually found not guilty of all charges. I was found not guilty of all charges. But I was sacked, and I was found guilty of having talked about the charges in public because the charges were themselves an official secret. I just think that's wonderful. I think that's wonderfully Kafkaesque. I'm actually quite pleased to have been sacked in such an insanely Kafkaesque manner. I think that was tremendous.
Wow. Wait, so that was after the charges were already public?
Yes, that was after the charges were already.
Wow. Wow. That's horrifying. Wow, bastard. So this was what, 2000?
2004.
Was this in the mid?
2003, 2004.
Right, that's what I thought. Right. Wow. So did you have a more idealistic idea of your own government prior to that?
I think so. I had come across things which weren't good, including British policy in Sierra Leone and with the invasion of Sierra Leone, and the employment of mercenaries in Africa by the British government. Things which I'd objected to and tried to stop in my various positions I'd held prior to that. But but they tended by and large to be things where I disagreed with the policy, but I could see that a reasonable human being could think that actually that was the best thing to do in the circumstances. I didn't agree, but I didn't think you were a monster if you wanted to do that. The use of torture on an industrial scale to gather intelligence after 9/11 was something where I just didn't think any reasonable person, any humane or ethical person, could go along with it. And I also thought it was illegal. The government's acting entirely illegally here. And maybe, people tell me I'm naive. People say that I should realize that in the 70s and 80s, they were torturing people in Northern Ireland all the time. Maybe that's true. But there's a difference between knowing something which doesn't affect you personally and being confronted with it in your daily working existence. And that was the main difference to me. I just found that I was involved in things that I just couldn't in conscience be involved in.
So this whole thing would have been an eye-opening experience, and then I presume after that you started doing more and more research and uncovering more and more things, which changed your perspective even further.
Yeah, that's true. It did change my perspective even further, and of course I discovered that I had, over 20 years, and particularly, in the Foreign Service, we do work very, very closely with the intelligence services an awful lot. I had a great deal of experience of how government works at the senior level and at ministerial level, which simply wasn't available to people like Julian, in a sense, who knows a very great deal, but has never worked at the top levels of government. So my ability to blend, if you like, an analysis of what government's doing wrong, and share with people who are very good at that analysis my practical information of how they work and how they think and what they do and how they operate, turned out to be a very useful synthesis.
Indeed, it has been. Your input has been really useful for figuring out what's going on with especially with all of the latest nonsense that's been unfolding in the UK, with the Philip Cross thing, as well as the Skripal case and Skripal case 2.0 and whatnot. Your writings have been very useful. So can you, besides the kind of go-to of sexual misconduct accusations, would you? Oh, did we lose him? Looks like we lost Craig Murray.